So this panel is titled Freedom of Choice. So, do we still enjoy the freedom of choice in our climate and environmental policy in each state? This is a question you might ask when you discuss various environmental agencies in the area of climate and energy. The European Union is particularly active in this field because, according to some specialists, it wants to take over the whole jurisdiction of the member states when it comes to climate and environmental protection and energy. I've already mentioned the year 2014. This was when the EU introduced the framework of the energy and climate policy, and they defined the goals, which were meant to force member states to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions and to boost the share of renewables on the market, energy market. The strategy of the Green Deal is also largely controversial. It's also the strategy is supposed to decarbonize economies, European economies, to make them zero-emission economies, but it disregards economic differences between member states. Fit for 55 used to be also very controversial. This scheme in turn introduces changes in the emission trading process, but this project was blocked yesterday by the European Parliament, and their most important assumptions were returned to the Committee on the Climate Committee in the European Parliament. So this is the context of what the EU is doing and other international organizations are doing. And in this context, let me ask you, so if there are some changes being imposed on a state, what can the state do? What are the limits of someone else interfering with your internal policy, and what can we do to protect the environment? These are the questions I would like my panelists here to address. Dr. Wąssowski, could you be the first panelist to answer, please? So I would welcome a lawyer's approach here. What are the legal boundaries of international institutions interfering with a state's policy? And please give us some examples, because we had the example of the Białowieża forest, but maybe you can come up with more examples. Thank you. A lawyer is always in a very convenient situation, because we never know what the answer is. If you are asking me about the legal constraints, where the legal framework should define that, but the environmental protection is a complicated issue for lawyers, because you have to always rely on the international law. And here there is a huge problem, because in general it's a global issue. And Fit for 55 has been controversial, and so has been the Green Deal. And this is largely due to the fact that they do not regulate the whole world, the whole problem, that they do not govern the whole protection system, because, as we know, emissions know no boundaries, no borders. So such legal incentives, because actually this was what the Green Deal was to be about, to incentivize the member states to change their strategies related to the environment. But in principle, this is imperfect. That's how I would describe it. Now the boundaries, the constraints for international organizations. Well, Turów is, to me, the most striking example. The ruling by the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, which has been led to a huge controversy in Poland because it interferes with politics as well. Because actually we don't know how a state should respond to such a ruling that a state disagrees with, if the state considers that this ruling goes outside of the European treaties, which are the foundations of the EU. So the only answer from a lawyer would be that only non-legal aspects, only political aspects could be the aspects in play when you want to be opposed to such steps. And also here you have soft law, which the EU adores. Well, Fit for 55 and the Green Deal was a good example. There are so many legal terms that are uncertain, indefined, that it all comes down to the political power of each member state, unfortunately. Thank you. Now a question to Mr. Mazurek. A question about the National Fund for Environmental Protection and about the cooperation of the fund with international organizations. What does it look like? Do these organizations interfere with or meddle with the policy of the fund in Poland? Thank you. Thank you for having me. If I may, I would like to add a point to the previous question, because there are some large institutions, and now the fund. Well, for 2 years now, well, we cannot forget about one thing. We've focused today on the European Union, but there is also one more aspect of the European and global politics. We have 3 international conventions: the Rio Conventions, the Climate Convention, the Deserts Convention, and the Biodiversity Convention. They are often underappreciated. By the Rio Convention, the Climate Convention was recognized. Its importance was recognized by Mr. Szyszko, the late Minister Szyszko. Because the ideas of the EU don't come out of the blue. There's always a source. If you followed what happened in Nairobi, they have the UNEP Convention. You have the Climate Convention, you have more conventions, and this is where important decisions are made that later on translate into the European decisions, and which in turn translate into the economic goals of each member state. This politics is extremely influential if you want to control economies and economic growth in different member states. So these 3 conventions in Rio were created to make sure that the world develops in a sustainable way. But we can see what the effects are. So there are no effects, and often in response, decision makers want to be more ambitious, and the EU also does that. We can help you. We can take the matter to the ECJ, and this will motivate you. Well, also from the point of view of the financial sector, I can tell you that database policy, we should rely on indices, on goals that are measurable, that are plausible, and not based on ideology. And I'm not afraid of using this word. And this is very important because this also is something that underlies other policies that later on affect us, common citizens. I'm thinking about Lech Kaczyński, the late Kaczyński. In one of his books, he said that the world should be based on values. So if the world doesn't rely on value, can it deliver on anything? Well, it's very difficult, and it doesn't have to lead to sustainable development. Well, and speaking about the fund, we are one of the 3 pillars of funding of environmental projects. The fund was created over 30 years ago, and the principle was simple: the polluter pays. Before we entered the EU, we already brought about the change, and we were able to reduce the emissions by 30% and keep the current level of the GDP. So we wanted to make the environment better for people in the EU, and we do it in the fund together with the regional branches of the fund and with the Polish Development Bank. We've been doing this for the last 30 years, and this experience is very valuable, especially for one of the countries nearby that soon will embark on a lot of reconstruction projects. And we always have been human-centered in the fund. We want to make a change, make a difference for people, and not for some abstract trends that keep changing. But we can see that the war has been a game changer. Okay, I have a question now to you, editor. So you're a journalist, you deal with international politics and international issues. So what are the limits of interfering, of international organizations interfering with the internal politics of member states? What are the limitations, the constraints, also including climate and environmental politics?
Well, thank you for hosting me. It's a great honor to be here among eminent speakers. I'm actually also a lawyer, and I can tell you a dirty little secret of lawyers. When they say yes, but it's the law, then it's not exactly always like that. It's always open for interpretation. I always give the example of the no bailout rule, and the Eurozone was only created under one condition, that there would be a legal article banning bailouts within the Eurozone, and then somehow it was possible to circumvent that. And indeed, you mentioned the coal plant in Turo, and indeed the fact that the Polish government is claiming that the EU is violating its competences. Well, in the past, myself and other people, many people within the PiS party here in Poland also, have been proposing the idea of a European subsidiarity court, which would be some kind of a mother-in law for the ECJ, for the European Court of Justice. So to enable for the possibility, if you don't agree with a certain ruling, then you can appeal against the ECJ, but only on the basis of distribution of powers, only on the basis of the claim that the ECJ would not have respected the distribution of competences within the EU. That's when it comes to the legal aspects. I think fundamentally, what are we talking about here? I mean, there's an aspiration among the member states of the EU to reduce CO2 emissions. So I would say, look, it's one thing that you agree at the European Union level to achieve a certain ambition of reducing CO2 greenhouse gas emissions by a certain date. It's yet another thing that you micromanage and tell countries how to implement that. And unsurprisingly, the second thing is what the European Union is doing. It's not only setting targets to reduce CO2 emissions, it's also setting targets to have at least a certain percentage of your energy provision from a very experimental, inefficient, unreliable source of energy, renewables, wind and solar. Now, don't get me wrong, I would love for our energy to come from wind and solar for 100%, but I don't think you will find any expert who claims that this is possible. Another thing that the EU is doing is it's locking in policies. So it's sort of getting countries and member states to agree something, a certain policy. So you don't have the option of trial and error as much anymore. Maybe it is a good idea to subsidize renewables, wind and solar, but maybe after a few years, if you see, oh, this isn't really working, then it's much harder because of the fact that it's locked into EU regulation to change policy. Of course, they're also spending a lot of money for this. I'm never a fan of the government spending money, and certainly not the European Union. And I think if you only look at the reports of the European Court of Auditors every year, then you can see what a total disaster spending by the European Union has been over many decades. Of course, you can find good examples. A broken clock is correct twice a day. But I think the debate on that should be settled. Last but not least, the EU is actually also through the back door involved in taxation. It has its so-called ETS system, emission trading system, which is effectively a tax on industry and therefore a tax on consumers. So I don't think the European Union should be involved in taxation in any way. I'm not against the EU. I think it's a great, it could be a great vehicle to scrap trade barriers and to open up trade. I think this has also been quite successful and a quite successful aspect of EU cooperation. But please keep the European Union level as far away from taxation in any form as possible.
Teraz zwrócę się do...
Now I will come back to Doctor and ask about issues related to the law. How should the state react to too extensive interference into climate, into energy, into environmental protection? How the state can counteract this? In general, law is based on sanctions. We have 3 lawyers here, and it seems that irrespective of the culture or social culture, the lawyers are always going to look for sanctions. If we have legal norms and standards which should be effective for a lawyer, an effective one is one which has sanctions and which are executable. I have the impression that in the area of environmental protection and interference, we have a very interesting dispute between the PGE and Greenpeace, which definitely through the mediation of certain advertising and PR activities is interfering in the developmental business strategy of a big Polish enterprise. And it seems that in light of Polish law, we don't have the legal standards or norms which will make it possible to interfere with the situation, because there's freedom of speech. There's a certain paradigm which is part in Article the right to information about the environment, which is part of our constitution. Also, we're supposed to, the Polish Republic, and is supposed to give access to that to the citizens. So it seems that in terms of NGOs, we have a certain trap here, because we have an axiological argument of freedom. On the one hand, freedom of speech and access to information, influence of citizens or social organizations or groups of citizens impacting. On the other hand, the People's Republic of Poland and Article 5 has obliged that it should ensure environmental protection in line with sustainable development. So how do we balance these aspects? I think that the Polish legislator doesn't have any concept right now, and in the detailed and EU levels, it seems that these strategies, soft laws, projects, whatever you would call them, which are dedicated to member states by the European Commission, European Parliament, seem to more lean towards the interference of various social organizations, and especially in the area of environmental protection. And let's, of course, select it democratically. We have to add that and remember about that. And again,
Once again, I cannot give a clear answer to point you to specific legal norms which should act in those. So speaking a non-legal lingo, those organizations have more rights than the state, than state bodies. In my conviction, this is the situation in Poland right now. In my conviction. An example of that, ladies and gentlemen, we have a number of conventions on access to information. We have also non-EU conventions that we participate in, and a very important old case of Dolina Rozpuda Valley, where just protecting several species and the law allows for certain natural compensation. There's a number of houses in the Mazurki town, even though I don't come from that region of Poland, but I was there. I saw the homes. I saw the anguish of those persons, where you could move the habitats, basically. We have relocated a number of species, whether it's moving some species of foxes, or from the Natura 2000 or the Habitat Directive. But these companies were designing, developing, and then they were proposing solutions, and the road was built, but several years ago. But the key road, in terms of our security and the Via Baltic, delayed investments, so an effective state which uses its soft power or employs its soft power, and Sławor spoke about how various organizations can be used in order to realize certain political movements. But I think they are international in our company in international nature, and there are various sources of finance for these organizations. But that is the case that there is a big potential that certain policies not necessarily are in line with the policies of the state interests. A good example here could be various activities. There's some ecological foundation with Nord Stream 2 in one of those regions in Germany, which were ecology is a good excuse to manage certain subject matters in such a way that they reach the heart of people. Through that heart, if somebody has a sick heart or an ill heart, they don't go to a shaman in the European countries, but they go to a heart surgeon and get a bypass. I mean, our emotions decide about certain situations, but being in the perspective of a previous official, but we can't refer to emotions, but to provisions of the law. Frequently here the case is that organizations try to impact non-democratically, but of course that's a certain skew. And several years ago we had the Greenpeace protest in the roof, and where Prime Minister Beata Szydło had her in the defense of Polish democracy in the European Parliament, and a very strong presentation, and then there was a live transmission. They were counting that there would be police there and they would pacify such a peaceful organization. That was not successful, but there's also, let's say, a sense of a delicate situation. Now I would have a question to the President, maybe of a slightly different subject. I would like to ask about the historical senses, and from your perspective as a participation of many delegations and climate events, and also under the auspices of the UN, has the role of these international institutions transformed or changed over the years, and its impact on the policy of states in the area of environmental protection? There was a moment that in Poland we underappreciated the presence of large delegations at international conventions. This changed, and Professor Jan Szyszko organized these conferences also in Poland, but to show not only Poland but the countries of our region and what kind of challenges we are faced with, where are we post-war World War II, and what kind of technologies we have, but also what are our local sources of ensuring energy security. What's important is to be present during these debates, build a coalition of states which have similar economic challenges in terms of transformation. It's also important to take a close look at these events. And ladies and gentlemen, if a country like Poland is reducing from the Kyoto Protocol its emissions at a volume, but in the meantime other countries have emitted and there was no settlement, and these are serious European countries, so it requires the activity to be present. As I mentioned, a lot happens in Nairobi, a lot in the conventions, a lot informal dialogue, so this is key. And what countries have to do is to have well-prepared officials, negotiators, but also their representatives in those institutions, so that if those institutions are not representative, if this is not based on on appropriate arguments and scientific data which have to propose certain solutions, then this will lead to, in reality, a certain crisis. We have that crisis already, and we're seeing, let's say, ladies and gentlemen, the rich West can decide how the South should develop, which didn't have the possibility to develop their economies. But does that mean that we should be satiated and others shouldn't develop because of climate reasons? No, we should assist in developing those countries. And where in the past for Poland, somebody would ask, well, how much would we lose if we supported Poland during their time of development? So there are no free lunches, and we have to effectively use various solutions for the development of our economies. If we're talking about the development of electromobility, we should ask if I would want to, and the National Fund is doing this, and the environmental protection, where fire departments have fire vehicles. We don't have fire vehicles that are produced in Poland. We would like to have that production here in Poland. It's just economic pragmatism, so we can develop the technology here and not just be a place where money is being spent. So we want to develop our country, so our fatherland, our motherland is being developed, and the region develops, and we cooperate, and not carbon linkage policy. And of course the war has changed this, pivoted this situation, but there are a lot of technologies to build the values here. But we also have to remember about certain traps of transformation. We can't forget about the war for rare metals or precious metals, and also the security and related to the security of the state in a classic understanding, but also climate and natural security. There are no coincidental subject matters at such events, whether it's the climate conference or convention on climate or policy, then this can be a factor of development. My short statement concluding, dynamic economic development, we preserve that, but also maintain the indicators that we have. Right now, for today, people understand a little bit differently that the development should be a change in the paradigm, that we stop developing. Of course, there's that border somehow, but the potential is still quite great, and it can't be that just part of the world is a beneficiary of development, of growth, technological growth, and economic growth. So that's from an international perspective. Also, on the international perspective, I would like to ask Peter Cleppe, and from your perspective as an expert on international matters and international policy, what methods and measures can international institutions interfere in the policy of states related to the protection of the environment, ecology, and what kind of threats can such interference bring with it?
Well, before I discuss climate policy, I'd like to mention a big crisis that is only actually taking place or occurring in the Netherlands and in Belgium, and that's, I don't think, getting a lot of attention outside, and that's the challenge to reduce nitrogen. So I had to look it up. Well, I only know the Dutch word for it, stikstof. The thing is, nitrogen is something we need, but somehow, according to ecologists, if too much of it is landing on vulnerable environmental land, it causes damage. And this is not some kind of weird side issue, especially in the Netherlands. A few years ago, there was a risk that all new construction projects in the Netherlands would have to be suspended if this would not be dealt with. So this was actually a massive issue. And it's quite complex, but what's the backstory? This has to do with EU regulation, with EU regulations aiming to cut nitrogen pollution, if you can say, combined with the Natura regulations, which I think you mentioned. Yes, so basically the Netherlands, but also Belgium at the beginning, when this was all voluntary and fun, they were very enthusiastically designating all kinds of areas as under threat. I think there was also some money linked to it. As a result of it, a lot of territory was designed as vulnerable environmental land. But then combined with new regulations, this meant that, to cut a long story short, a lot of agriculture would no longer be possible close to these particular areas, even if often some of these farms had been active long before even these vulnerable nature reserves have been created. And we have a similar problem now at a much smaller scale, thankfully, in the north of Belgium, in Flanders. Now the thing is, the Dutch government is planning to spend, I think, 25 billion euros to deal with this nitrogen challenge. But I just thought it was important to mention how sort of slowly, regulations and EU policies that seem to be only about like grabbing a bit of subsidy money from the EU budget and relatively innocent for the economy, sort of when in combination also with national gold plating and new national regulations and implementations that go very far by enthusiastic administrations, can become a huge drag on the economy. And I think at that point the Netherlands also immediately reduced sort of the speed on the highways to 100 km/h to enable construction projects to go forward, as this would then count or give them sort of in the legislative context a bit more room to maneuver and to continue this construction. There was also quite a bit of judicial activism involved. Judges that ordered the government on the basis of indeed interpretation of European soft law, but also hard law, to implement certain measures. Long story short, we have to be very careful with all these regulations, which signing up to all of these EU rules and programs and policies. We have to be very careful that when these are transposed into national law, that we don't have gold plating, that we don't have administrations too active, enthusiastically implementing it all. Then when it comes to climate, there's a book by, I think, Germany's most senior economist, Hans Werner Sinn, and he basically claims that the whole European approach is about trying to suppress demand for energy. This, of course, fits very well with the green philosophy, the original Flemish party. They are now called the Flemish Green Party. Today they are called the Greens, but they used to be called To Live Otherwise. So that's the core of their ideology. Yes, protecting the environment, but primarily to change our way of life. If you say, oh, why don't we have an energy provision for 100% composed of nuclear energy, and then we can live it up and continue to live the way that we live, that's not the answer they want to hear. The answer they want to hear is, no, we have to be more simple. to go back. They probably don't say that we have to live less long, because that would of course also be the consequence if you continue their logic. Now Hans van der Zin says, if you do that, if you focus on reducing demand for energy, what you actually do is you give an incentive to fossil fuel producers to produce more and to drop their price. And basically the whole point was to avoid fossil fuel extraction. And because of the current approach, he actually says this process of fossil fuel extraction is accelerated, and I think that's also what we see. Maybe one more thing about the reliance on renewables. As I mentioned, these are unreliable, meaning that the sun does not always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, so you need batteries. But as Professor Furfari always says, he's a great expert on the matter, battery technology really has not improved all that much since the end of the 70s. So whatever you hear, that's not a solution yet, unfortunately. So you need backup. And you need backup. You have three choices. The first choice is coal, the second is gas, and the third is nuclear. Now, they don't want coal, and they certainly don't want nuclear, so you end up with gas. So you end up with Putin, because Putin has a lot of cheap gas. In sum, Germany's energy dependence from Russia is not some kind of an outcome of a market process, a natural outcome. This is something artificial. This is closely linked with climate policies, with promotion of wind and solar power that need gas as a backup. And the Green says, yes, of course, but in the future we will have 100% renewables and we will no longer need Putin's gas. But that is so far remote in the future, and no expert thinks that's even remotely possible, that effectively if you support wind and solar, you are supporting Russia, unless you also support nuclear. You can combine nuclear and renewables. So that's, I think, why nuclear is so important.
I teraz chciałbym powiedzmy.
Now I would like to come back to the subject matter that is circling around us, and that is the EU policy, specifically the new Green Deal and regulations related to Fit for 55. And this will be my last question to our speakers. And I would begin with Dr. Wąssowski, and I would like to ask you, how is the development of the Fit for 55 and New Green Deal from a legal standpoint, and the development of that, and how much interference into the Polish legal system will it require to introduce these new regulations proposed by the EU? I was afraid that Piotr, you would ask someone else, but the consistency, which is very surprising here. Until yesterday, we probably could have been speaking about more specifically about Fit for 55. That's why are you saying that the question is a little bit perhaps not current? Yes, but also there may be a boomerang effect and more ambitious parameters. Yes, because let's say they have been objected to for reconsideration. So the packages of regulations which have brought together under the Fit for 55 assume certain objectives, ecological objectives or goals. And for me, and of course I'm not an expert on ecology, but I am a legal expert, and I don't know where the 55% by a specific number and why for that number for the reduction. Is it justified for the planet, for the earth, and is it in some biological aspect impacting, and whether it's going to help? And that's one thing. There were the objectives and the fund. The fund who will simply support. But the problem is that as we, Poland, in terms of the law since Second World War and later on in the area of public law and administrative law, where the civil servant has or an official has some decision making. We've moved away from, let's say, the freedom of a civil servant, civil servants or officials' decision about certain objectives. In the Fit for 55, there's an exact reverse of that. It seems that the European EU official or European official, because also expert, there's an expert committee, they will decide who knows on which basis of criteria, who to support, who not to support. For a lawyer, all this 55 package is one big mystery. It's completely incomprehensible. There are no clear rules of the game. It's clear that there's a game and there are rewards, there are monies. But if I were to be honest, and lawyers are never always fully honest, so please take a correction on that. So I don't know what the principles of the game are or the rules of the game. I hope that President Mazurek has an answer to that, because he's seen a lot, he's traveled around the world a lot, and he probably knows how Fit for 55 was supposed to work. I will just like to ask the doctor whether some geopolitical issues could have impact. So the situation in the Ukraine, they're saying, so honestly speaking, I didn't really believe that the war in the Ukraine and Russia's aggression will sober the European Parliament. The way I'm observing a little bit from afar, I had the concept that the green ideology is more important, or whatever you would call it, but fortunately some voice of reason did come up. I'm not a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist. I don't really know what happened in the thought process in the heads of those representatives, but we can be just pleased that war shows a change in the paradigm and should fix a paradigm from a pure green paradigm to a more rational. The answer is probably only known by President Mazurek, so I'll gladly listen to him. A similar question to him.
About the Green Deal and Fit for 55. Is it an effective answer to climate change, or is it a political step to take over the jurisdiction over climate from member states? This debate, how to combat climate change, has been held not only at the European level. I've always thought that when there is a debate on a global level, we have to speak in a Polish language with Polish data, and this is what we did during COP24. There are a few countries in the EU which don't have a lot to say about it, and there are smaller countries that take care of their interests, though. So this is also a question of the narrative, how you speak about your interests and how you turn them into practice in real politics. So the question is, the oldest question is, who does it serve? Well, it's a fact. We have extreme weather conditions. We have to change the infrastructure. We have to upgrade the transmission grid. The Polish scheme, My Electricity, was very successful. We were the second country in Europe to develop prosumer energy that relies on solar power, despite the fact that we are not Italy. So sunlight is not something you can take for granted here. We had to replace the ineffective heat sources. But it was said there that the goals will be met thanks to technologies yet to be invented. And I worked in a bank for a few years, and if someone showed me such a project, a risk assessment would never approve it. Because if we look at the world from the financial perspective, financial flows, cash flows, and guarantees and some liability and responsibility, which follows from the law. Well, I have to say that it would never come through. The state is very much involved in political transfers and cash transfers. And the Green Deal was supposed to be a response to the climate issues globally. The EU says it wants to be a leader, to be followed by other countries globally. And each time we hear about emissions from Chinese plants, well, they do emit pollution, they do pollute. So now it's difficult to speak about resources that rely on weather today, because before we do that, we need to upgrade the grid, the low voltage grid in Poland. We have to build it. So we need $100 billion. So this is a lot of money to be spent. Also, the philosophy of spending is now changing, because the EU now gives more money to returnable schemes. And also some solutions require legal changes, not only new technologies. So I think that while the Green Deal is an idea to make some transfers, well, business-wise, it's not profitable. It doesn't pay, because we have to keep subsidizing. And we can't forget that. So now the philosophy has changed and has shifted towards returnable schemes, but we have, well, the EU is in generally well perceived in Poland, but history never ends, history continues, and the EU wanted to join the countries through the Green Deal to guarantee a better future. But what's the future if it's said that each child is a potential CO2 emission source? So a conservatist looks at this and, well, green conservatism says that we'll do it for the state, for the world, for our families. But we need to know why or what for, not only to feel better. So I think that there are some elements in the Green Deal, but take the countries that have a history, but because of the iron countries, iron curtain. Well, we will diversify the sources. We are doing this. Take late Lech Kaczyński, the terminal. The gas terminal, despite the fact that we do have our own fossil fuels resources. This is a capital we should tap into, but of course we want to develop modern technologies, but we need more time than some other countries to do that. And the report presented today mentions Sweden. Well, if you have a lot of water, it's easier. But also it's about how you approach the law. Nature 2000 was a system to monitor nature so that no species dies, but it was turned into a blockade. So it sounds like science fiction that in Poland we do have rivers, they do have energy, you can also harness, but I doubt this will be done precisely because of Nature 2000. The whole Vistula River is covered by as a Nature 2000 area. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to look for the most cost-efficient solutions. So if we will be able to use the Green Deal funds, well, this needs to be a deal, a well-organized scheme with very specific data. We need to know where we are going, because now we have a very, very powerful PV installations that unfortunately are shut down because the grid is not capable of withholding it. So our approach needs to be complex. and comprehensive. We have interconnectors here now. They are also meaningful, but this cannot come at the cost of the poorest or of some countries with different dynamics, which have done a lot to improve their environmental performance measured by the number of species and their economic rankings. We can see that over the years Poland has spent a lot. Poland has been growing very dynamically, but this is thanks to hard work and not only external funding. We have proven that we can use external funding in a successful way. So Poland is prepared to make investment projects, but at a reasonable rate to avoid any negative economic impact for society. This is our conservative approach. And I have a question to you, editor, about Peter Cleppe, about successful. Is it a so should we combat climate change effectively, or should we try to interfere with the politics of member states?
Well, so let me maybe give an overview of what this infamous Green Deal would do. So it would expand the ETS, the effective climate tax, to housing, transport, aviation. So the Commission and MEPs amongst each other are fighting on how extreme they should be. There's indeed finally a realization that maybe the war has changed a few things, but let me tell you, it's the Brussels bubble is already a bubble, and within the bubble you have another bubble, the European Parliament. So it's kind of hard to penetrate there. Then they want to ban diesel and petrol cars from 2035, just because we can. So top-down social engineering, stifling innovation, anything you could expect from MEPs. I think that's quite unfortunate. It's also unfortunate to see that apparently the Polish government is officially in support of that idea. Now, look, if the market decides that electric cars are superior, great. I'm not married to diesel or petrol technology, but I think we have to leave these very complex outcomes to the market. In history, it's never been possible to predict, what kind of technology standard would prevail, the VHS, the GPS. Even the greatest experts didn't know until it actually happened. And sometimes a superior technology did not become the norm because there were some market factors that still, also were at play, not just technological factors. So this is very complex. Then there's the deforestation part, there's isolation standards, there's of course the CBAM. We have the ETS, sort of the domestic European climate tax, and then we have the climate tax on foreign imports, the CBAM, which likely violates the WTO rules. It's blatant protectionism. We should not forget that perhaps other countries may engage in protectionism if suddenly Europe starts imposing expensive climate taxes on all kinds of imports. We still will have a fight in the future on what will be subject. And then last but not least, there's the social climate funds, because clearly they already realize the economic damage that will be done. And as Professor Furfari said, he quoted Reagan, when it moves, tax it; if it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. So that's the social climate fund. Now, the Commission has estimated that the cost of the European Green Deal is 1.3 trillion, but according to experts like Bjorn Lomborg, a Danish climate economist, it's actually 4,000 to 5,000 billion euro, and this all to reduce a climate reduction of 0.004%. So I think even the most voluntarist climate activist should admit that cost-benefit-wise this is disproportionate, if it even works. Now, it's one thing you want to reduce CO2, it's another how do you do it, and I think the obvious method to reduce CO2 and to combine this with efficient energy generation is of course nuclear power generation. Nuclear power is safe, cost is very low. Of course, you would need to probably liberalize the safety regulations a little bit that are excessive right now. And also important today, you know, it's geostrategically very important, not just versus Russia, but also other authoritarian countries that it may be a good idea to trade with them, fine, but not to the point that we're actually strongly dependent. That's clearly been a mistake. Of course, there's people who talk about the safety of nuclear plants, and that's not of course, that's a serious argument that should be taken serious. But then I always like to quote George Monbiot. I don't know if you know him, but he's one of the most well-known environmentalist activists in the United Kingdom. And right after the Fukushima disaster, he wrote an article in The Guardian, and the title is Why I Changed My Mind About Nuclear Energy. So he used to be against, and he said, after Fukushima, I'm in favor of nuclear energy because this is the ultimate test for nuclear energy. You had a crappy plant, a very old plant, badly maintained, and it was first subject to a tsunami, and then an earthquake, followed by a meltdown with actually hydrogen explosion. That's another thing. People talk about hydrogen being the future. Well, hydrogen can be dangerous. So this was like the ultimate stress test. Of course, it was a total disaster. Many people died because of the earthquake and the seaquake. But if you go to the Wikipedia article of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, you will find that it's very hard to find proof that a lot of people died because of the nuclear meltdown. The Japanese government has admitted that one person died from it. Some NGOs claim it's 200. Well, even if it's 200, this is much lower than the deaths due to coal, due to gas extraction, and even renewable extraction. So I think the big political struggle of this year is to get the German Greens to finally admit that the 3 remaining nuclear power plants in Germany can be extended. Now, even if they would decide this now, it's possible that you'll have a period where, for technical reasons, they have to, shut down anyway for a bit. And there's many challenges. You need qualified staff in Germany. But that can all be done. And personally, I think it's very important, not just that that Germany continues with nuclear power, which is a good idea for CO2 reduction and all the other reasons, but also that the German Greens are the ones to openly defend this, because this would, I think, hurt their legitimacy and their pontificating for top-down economic planning for years and years to come. So, and I'm quite optimistic. Today, the German finance minister, the liberal politician Christian Lindner, he was in an open discussion, in an open challenge with Chancellor Scholz about this. And I predict, it's political gravity. It's so if you're in a crisis and you don't know how to cope without Russian energy, then to say, oh yeah, we have 3 perfectly functioning nuclear plants, let's shut them down. It's so obvious that you should not do that, that I'm actually quite hopeful that that Germany will continue with nuclear energy.
Pozostawiając Państwa w niepewności.
So I leave you with some uncertainty about the Green Deal and the European policies, and this is where I would like to leave you, because the debate then ends here, the debate on the freedom of choice and what do we need in our countries to protect the environment. Let's have a round of applause for our guests, for our panelists. And now I will give the floor to the moderator.